Welcome to Discovery. My name is Abhi. I'm a research manager here at Efficiency Canada. And today I will be talking to you about rental energy efficiency in the context of a new report we have coming out at the end of this month. The four things to remember from this presentation. Number one is that rental energy efficiency policy is really hard to get right, and I'll explain why. We'll talk a little bit about how policy mixes can be used as a tool to resolve that problem. I will show you a little bit about how energy justice perspectives can be used as a sort of a guide, as a lodestar to help us get to good rental energy efficiency policies. And we will conclude with what we're calling a tenant bill of rights as a kind of foundational principles for rental energy efficiency. So first, why is there a need for policy to begin with in the rental housing space? So these numbers are for Canada, and the pernicious problem with housing and rental housing in particular, especially in Canada, is that renters are more likely to benefit from energy efficiency. Even though they're only a third of the population, they are extremely overrepresented among Canadians with low incomes. 2 out of 3 low income Canadians are renters. Renters experience unaffordable housing, and energy is a part of the mix. So households that spend more than 30% of their income on housing in Canada are regarded as living in unaffordable housing. And 30% of renters experience unaffordable housing. They are more likely to have housing that needs major repairs, more likely to experience mold and mildew and dampness in their housing, and also more likely to experience dissatisfaction with houses being too cold or too warm. And in addition to that, from a demographic perspective, renters are more likely to be newcomers to Canada or seniors living on fixed incomes. So renters are, they're more likely to benefit from energy efficiency, but conversely are often less likely to take action, in large part because, and in my view, building energy efficiency policy in Canada systematically excludes renters from policies and programs. If you read our previous report, Efficiency for All, we documented how most, even no income or no cost upgrade programs or financing programs in Canada at the federal level and the provincial level exclude renters. Granted, there are some government investments in affordable housing, but only about 1 in 5 or 1 in 6 renters in Canada lives in subsidized housing. A vast majority of renters live in private market rentals. So the need for a policy stems from the fact that renters are systematically excluded from policy, are unlikely to take action on their own accord due to the nature of their housing conditions and also due to socioeconomic variables in the absence of intervention. And that, I think, underscores the need for rental energy efficiency policy. But the challenge has been that traditionally rental energy efficiency policy has proved to be very challenging to get right. And the reason for that is it's often framed in these kind of orthogonal goals. So on one hand, we see the need for having more efficient buildings, and Canada has a net zero by 2050 goals, and energy efficiency retrofitting buildings has to be a part of that solution mix. But we also have a national right to housing now. And so these two policy goals are often framed or seen as being in tension. So, for example, imagine that we find ourselves in this kind of bottom left quadrant today in Canada where rental housing is inefficient and it's also insecure because you're one missed rent payment or one utility payment away from being evicted. So imagine you had a dial, right? And this is a magical, mythical dial. No such thing exists. But if you had a dial and you cranked it all the way up, and then the outcome of that was all of a sudden you had like 8 net zero buildings. You keep cracking this dial, you keep cracking this dial. You can get to your goals in this quadrant, but doing renovations while there are people living in place can be a huge challenge. It can be disruptive while renovations are taking place. It can lead to displacement or what is called renoviction, eviction and guide of renovation after the retrofits take place. If landlords are, for example, mandated to do some energy efficiency upgrades, there is concern that some of these costs will be pushed down to tenants who are already, as we saw earlier, experiencing unaffordable housing costs. So what some jurisdictions, especially in the European Union, have done is they try to exclude social housing or rental housing from meeting some of these policy targets. If you exclude, let's say, social housing or affordable housing or rental housing from mandatory building performance standards, for example, you'll end up in a situation where rental housing is substandard relative to other housing. You might end up with a situation where housing is a little more stable, renters are not evicted due to these renovations, but you might end up with housing that does not meet the energy or the climate needs of today and tomorrow. The goal is to get to this quadrant here, and we will talk about some ways that we think we can get there. The approach that we took in our report was looked at policies. On one hand, we're looking at policies that speak specifically about efficient buildings, not about rental housing, not about renting, but buildings. What are energy efficiency policies and what are they saying about how we can improve efficiency in buildings on one hand? And then we took a very close look at policies that have been deployed in Canada, in United Kingdom, European Union, United States on protecting tenants. And so these would be like rent controls, rental assistance, evicting moratoriums, things like that. And so our approach was to take some policies from energy efficiency universe, because these universes seldom overlap with each other. So take some policies from building policy universe, take some policies from tenant protection universe, and mix them up a little bit and do some kind of narrative scenario building to see what likely outcomes could be for different stakeholders like renters and landlords and so on. And that's what the report details. And here's a quick example of what that like. This is the prevailing status quo right now in Canada. In most provinces, I would argue, is that we find ourselves in the bottom left quadrant where we have energy efficiency policies that systematically excludes renters, and we have rental policies that offer some protections to tenants. There's, if you miss a rental payment or if you miss a utility payment, there is just cause eviction if the landlord has a just cause to evict you. So this is the standard today. And so you can take a mix of policies and see how they lead to potentially different outcomes. And these outcomes are contested. And I didn't measure this with a ruler. So these are like qualitative outcomes. So on one hand, let's say you started from an initial policy mix, and then you said, let's have an energy efficiency policies that do not exclude renters. So there are a lot of jurisdictions in Canada have a no cost program for low income homeowners or low cost financing for low income homeowners. So what if we expanded those programs to include landlords? So we included tenants. And so what happens there is that now rental housing qualifies for these programs. And so you would have likely more efficient buildings. But you can imagine a scenario here where, because some rental housing now all of a sudden has lower bills, it is a lot more comfortable to live in, it's less drafty. And you can imagine a scenario in the absence of tenant protections, how landlords could be compelled or could find themselves in a scenario where they receive funding to upgrade their home, and now they can now rent their home to someone else who can pay them a higher rent. Or they could use this renovation as an excuse to evict tenants. That's one possibility. So that's why this enhanced policy mix finds itself a little lower than initial policy mix on the secure housing front, but it is chances are that you might end up with some housing that is more efficient than what it is now currently. If you had a different mix of policies, so you took the efficiency for all policies we just talked about, and then you added what's called an affordability covenant. This is a common feature in some US low income programs. If you, as a landlord, apply on your tenant's behalf and receive funding to upgrade the unit, then you sign an affordability covenant that says you will, for a period of time, not increase rents, or you won't sell the house, or you won't evict the tenant. And if you do, you have to immediately repay the cost of what it took to upgrade the home. And so there's different ways in which you can set that up. And so in this mix of policies, you can see how a universe in which housing is a little bit more secure now, because the affordability covenant gives the tenant the ability to stay in the housing for a while, but also qualifies for housing is a little bit more energy efficient than it was before. But in reference to this, where there's no downsides for landlords, and you can see a universe in which a lot of landlords apply for this pre-funding, you can see a universe in which maybe not all landlords want to sign up for affordability covenant because it locks them to a certain rental for a certain. So this is the analytical framework in a way to think through how you can use a mix of policies, and then how you can mentally map the outcomes of these policies. And when you read our report, you'll see 3 different scenarios. We've outlined how different mix of policies can get us closer and closer to this elusive fourth quadrant. You can go home today, scan this QR code, and you will find about 200 different policies with links to specific policy documents. So if you're a local change maker, or your local municipal staff, provincial staff, researcher, you can use these specific policy documents and language. Look at how you can mix these different policies up and then come up with your own mix of rental energy efficiency. Now, if I ended my presentation here, my job would not be done. I would like to give you some guidelines for mixing these policies up. Now, I was at a conference earlier last month, and I used this analogy. If you have 200 different mix of policies, you can mix them up in any different permutation and combination, but sometimes you might end up with a disastrous mix. The analogy I used was I used to work back in the day in Subway making sandwiches. And you're called a sandwich artist, by the way. If you work at Subway, you're not a Subway maker or a sandwich maker, you're a sandwich artiste. And so you could pretend that you're a sandwich artist for your own local community by mixing these policies up. But if you've been a sandwich artist, you know that there are some things that don't go together. For example, the worst combination that I've ever experienced, someone asked me, was to put scrambled eggs with tuna on a Subway. And I don't care what your diet preferences are, but that's just, let's not do that. You can all agree. So there are certain, I'd say, norms or certain guidelines that we can use to think through how we can mix these different mix of policies together. And one place to look for these guidelines is energy justice principle. So energy justice, I mean, it's emerging. I see some people are disagreeing with me already, and that's always welcome. So just a quick breakthrough or breakdown of the energy justice principle is just a way of thinking through outcomes of energy efficiency. So procedural justice would be when you do a fair job of incorporating diverse perspectives into the decision-making process and people's priorities into decision-making process so that the outcomes reflect the priorities of people who are most affected by this. Distributive justice would be looking at how outcomes of our policies may be unfair or maybe leaving some people behind and being proactive about including them. And restorative justice is recognizing that certain groups of people experience ongoing harms due to policies of lack thereof, and then being proactive about repairing those harms and making them whole. And so here's how you would use, and these are just examples of how you could use some of those principles to mix up some of these policies together. First would be procedural. So you could take a mix of policies where you provide financial incentives for large corporate or private landlords to undertake deep retrofit. So that's a building efficiency policy. But you can mix that up with a tenant policy that says tenants have a right to get legal aid, the right to prior informed consent. And when you mix these two up, what you get is a policy that we call in our report a tenant liaison policy, where before a landlord undertakes a retrofit, they are required, in order to access this public funding or public financing or low cost financing, they're required to hire a tenant liaison who will work with the tenants, ensure that their priorities are reflected in the project plan, and that what they experience as challenges in living in that unit is reflected in the outcomes of the project, but also their needs around safety concerns or noise concerns while the renovation is happening is fairly accounted for and incorporated in the project. And this could be a requirement for federal, provincial, private funding on rental housing project. This would be one way to think about incorporating justice principles. Another would be distributive. This is an example that we covered earlier, where you take, right now, a lot of low-income programs in Canada, at least, rental housing don't qualify. So we expand that to make private landlords eligible for no-cost upgrade programs. But then in return for that, they agree to freeze rent for a certain amount of time, or to keep the units at an affordable rent for a fixed amount of time. And these are called affordability covenants. City of Ottawa is a great example. FCC Nova Scotia is an example. I'll use City of Ottawa. As a private landlord, you can be eligible for low cost financing to upgrade a unit. But if you don't maintain the unit at an affordable rate, the city can pull back the financing. You're required to repay their own immediately. So there's some skin in the game for landlords for keeping rents affordable and not evicting tenants. Restorative justice would be, for example, we know from Canada's experience with heat waves a couple of years ago, a vast majority of people that died from heat waves in Canada were seniors, a lot of them living in rental housing. I believe 98% of people who died due to heat wave 2 or 3 years ago in BC died in their own homes. And so we recognize that the outcomes of not having, for example, cooling, air conditioning affects different people differently. Seniors, people who spend a lot of time indoors, like single family households, single parent households, which in Canada, oftentimes 80% roughly of single parent households or single mom households, So these households spend a lot of time indoors and experience outcomes of not having cooling or air conditioning differently than some other groups. Recognizing this and incorporating this into our efficiency policies, for example, the not just having a performance standard in building that says you need to maintain an indoor temperature at a certain degree, but also ensuring that our utility programs, which are mostly focused on the demand side management strategies, are focused on reducing kilowatt hour usage. So, for example, I remember I used to be at the chair of a social housing nonprofit, and we struggled because it was a challenge working with our utility at the time to get more air conditioning unit because they were rewarded for reducing energy use and not potentially increasing energy use because of air conditioning. So having multi-fuel demand side management strategies where, and this is explained in more detail in our report, but a scenario where we use more efficient cooling solutions like heat pumps that can also double up as heating strategies in the winter so that we are doing multi-fuel demand side management. So we're not just looking at these with silos. And you combine that with some kind of requirement, like I see in the comments about having indoor temperature standards, like some cities like Hamilton, Mississauga have, is you'll end up with what is called the right to be cool, which is you in Canada, we must recognize that you have a right to having a certain standard for indoor temperatures in all seasons. So in all, if not most provinces in Canada, we have a winter temperature standard, right? So where housing is required to maintain heating at a certain level. I believe it's 21 degrees Celsius or 19 Celsius, depending on where you are. And so something like that for the summer would also be an example of how you combine these different policies to end up with a policy for rent. So to sum it up, we propose what we're calling a Renter Bill of Rights that will bring energy efficiency policy in line with our quite ambitious goals of giving everyone the right to housing and also doing that while meeting our 2050 net zero goals, while also leaving no one behind. And what we argue in our report is that we need to think in terms of energy efficiency policies as rather than focusing on an exhaustive cost benefit analysis and, oh, is this policy better? Then is that policy better? We can think of them as mixing them up by foregrounding concerns about justice and fairness. A policy mix approach, what it can do is it can open up these like goals of policymaking to go beyond reducing kilowatt hours, go beyond reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but thinking more broadly about social and economic issues and upholding and delivering on some fundamental rights that everyone in Canada should be entitled. And I can say this now because I just got my Canadian passport like a few months ago. So we as Canadians have a broader social civic responsibility for ensuring that we as a society work together to define energy efficiency policies to uphold and deliver these rights and not think of these as being in opposition or in tension. So some of these rights would be right to information on energy performance prior to renting the unit. A vast majority of households have no idea how much their utility bills are going to be before they're renting. And oftentimes it is the single largest controllable expense. Actually, it's the single largest uncontrollable expense if you're a renter when you rent a house. And it contributes significantly to budgetary issues and it contributes significantly to precarity of housing because if you miss one rental payment or you miss one utility payment, or if you miss one rental payment because you're eligible for too long, you are very close to being evicted. A right to prior informed consent would be where your priorities about the house is reflected in the retrofit plans that the landlord is making. For example, you could be experiencing mold and draftiness in your home. Those priorities should be reflected in the plans and your needs should be reflected in the procedures through which these decisions are being made. You have the right to maintain residence and tenure. So if you need to move out of a housing because there's significant renovations happening, and I know some provinces already have this, and we document that in our policy database in our report, is that you have the first right of refusal. You have the first right to come back to that unit. And so that people can't use this as an excuse to evict you and increase rents for the next person. You have the right to organize collectively and bargain with your landlord and negotiate with your landlord for some fundamental rights. And then you have the right to maintain well-being in your home. So we have some of this, right? So if you're a renter, and I've been a renter for a significant part of my life, and some landlords, and it's a gray area as experienced by renters, is can I put up a photograph of my family is often a contentious issue situation. But your right to make small or major changes to the inside of your home so that you can maintain well-being should be a fundamental, right? So we think and we propose that if we align our energy efficiency policies to upholding and maintaining these fundamental rights, and with these mix of policies, if we would better align our policy systems to the ambitious goals we have by 2050, which are these. And that's all I have for you today as far as my presentation goes. Thank you for being here. I will open this up to questions.
Thanks so much, Abhi. That was great. Yes, so we are going to open the floor to questions. Please use the Q&A box. I might miss them if you put them in the chat. And people can upvote what they really want to hear about. I'm sure Abhi won't mind. He already put his email on the screen. So I'm sure you could reach out for your specific question if we don't get to it. Okay, let's get started here, Abhi. Why do so many efficiency programs aimed at improving detached semis and townhomes exclude rental properties?
That is a great question. Full disclosure, we're doing a study right now to try to understand some of that, working with program managers to understand that. But my experience has been that in part is because the DSM programs are incentivized to find the most bang for the buck, right? So they're evaluated on total resource cost studies where they have to prove that the amount of money that they spend on making these changes is recovered by energy cost savings. So they find it easier to work with high volume housing. So social housing, for example, is often a big client of a lot of these utility demand side management programs because they can work with one kind of housing provider and do a big retrofit, right, or a shallow retrofit across a bunch of housing units and achieve their minimum goals. Another half of this is because that, frankly, a lot of these programs are concerned about downstream effects and program risk that comes from a story on CBC in the future, maybe, where, oh, this landlord got a bunch of energy retrofits and now they're evicting the tenants because they can increase the rents and that sort of thing. What we argue is that existing programs can actually go further in including rental housing if there were more protections for tenants, if there were policies that ensured that they can work together with landlords to provide that kind of affordability covenant. And if there were mechanisms in place through which DSM programs can enforce the affordability covenant, ensure that landlords are not unfairly increasing rents after they've accessed funding. So there's gaps there that need to be filled. I believe that if we found ways of filling those gaps, then my understanding is that DSM programs would be a little bit more open to the idea of working with landlords, because ultimately I think that they don't want to see themselves as being in a position where their programs end up having a negative outcome for renters.
Thanks, Abhi. So as a follow-up to that, will your report speak to which affordability covenants work best? So which ones are most effective for renters, but also most palatable for building owners?
Yes. So we haven't really ranked affordability covenants on which would be most effective for renters or building owners. But what we have done is provided a plethora of different ways in which affordability covenants have been enforced and have been provided. And some are better than others in terms of how you want to evaluate what the outcomes might be, how you want to evaluate the effectiveness of these covenants in terms of being able to enforce them. And I think effectiveness based on what the goals might be differs from stakeholder to stakeholder. So we haven't gone through and evaluated them, but I think it'll be a good discussion to have with a team of policy wonks to compare different policies. I can just say that some affordability covenants, the best features of affordability covenants are something that de-risk energy retrofits for all stakeholders involved. So program designers, they don't want to get into legal issues between tenants and landlords. From a justice perspective, we don't want renters to be the only ones who have to then stand up for their rights through covenants. And we need some kind of protection so that tenants can not only have this right on a piece of paper, but actually have the ability to manifest them and to enforce them. We also want to make it so that it's easy for landlords to sign up for programs. There's like multiple things that we need to balance. And I think a team of folks like, for example, at CMHC, who spend a lot of time looking at this sort of thing, can look at these different mixes of policies and mixes of different features that these covenants offer, and then put them together to see what the outcomes might be for different groups.
Thanks. So Joshua is asking what's in it for landlords. There's a paragraph here, so stick with me. I am a small time landlord, and I, beyond my commitment to climate action, don't see the financial benefits, and rentals are a business. I was fortunate enough to be able to take advantage of provincial and federal programs and still only covered about 30% of a retrofit. That was not a deep retrofit at my personal residence. Those costs will never be recovered through utility savings at a rental. 2 questions. How do you make this attractive to landlords, and how will policies be created for deep retrofits? Yeah.
That's a great question. My wife's family is also a small time landlord. And so I am very sensitive to these concerns. What researchers show is that landlords are more willing to participate in improving the energy efficiency of their property if the process of participating in that is made easier and the outcomes of that is in their interest. And so in some ways, improving energy efficiency for your property increases the long-term value of your property, increases the chance that the renter will stay in that unit. And of course, the research has shown that improving energy efficiency of housing improves property values, improves tenant retention, improves your relationship with tenants. And there are positive outcomes there. Now, granted, rental housing is a business. The in-housing has been commodified and assetized, and that's a whole other conversation. But even within that kind of transactional framework, there is a lot of opportunities for landlords, and we see time and time again, there are a lot of landlords who want their tenants to live in healthy, happy, and secure housing. And some of those goals are in tension with the need for that to be cost balanced. So what we are saying through our report is that there is a universe in which we can use low cost financing policies and mechanisms to ensure that we're not making it more difficult for landlords to undertake some of these changes. We're making it easier for them. So another way of looking at this is landlords also have a certain responsibility for upkeep of property. So we don't ask, for example, now, oh, what is the split incentive for landlords for having a functioning toilet? We just want landlords to maintain a unit with a functioning toilet, functioning shower. So one of the outcomes of this is that if you recognize that that your home is as a refuge against elements from the outside, and then increasingly in a world with changing climate, recognizing that your home has to provide certain rights and energy efficiency policies have to be aligned to help us as Canadians maintain those rights, then we'll start to see that having a more efficient home can be within the framework of what is expected from being able to rent a unit. Now, of course, the flip side of that is, and we all know this, is that having a lot more of these regulations by themselves don't always result in positive outcomes, both either for landlords or renters. There's many circumstances in which just rental housing goes underground and stuff like that. So we recognize that. Ultimately, what we are trying to do is to come up with a mix of policies that if there are some landlords out there, and research shows that there are, who want to improve energy efficiency of their homes, is that we make it easier for them to do.
Beatrice is asking about the Vienna case and how the city is owning the flats or the cooperative apartments, the co-ops. Has any thought been given to that for Canada? I guess is the question.
Yeah. So my understanding of the housing sector in Canada is that social housing is the responsibility for that housing is split among different levels of government, right? And so municipalities, at least in Ontario, some of the provinces own and maintain some affordable housing units. And a vast majority of them are run, or I should say a significant chunk of them are run by private nonprofits. I used to be on the board of one. Some of them are run by counties, and the administration of that is split. Now, do I think that if cities now all of a sudden started owning these homes and then renting these homes, would that lead to more positive outcomes for renters? It is difficult to answer that question. What I do see, given the current state of play in Canada, is that municipalities are unlikely to purchase and buy more housing. I know there is, like in BC, for example, there's a rental retention fund. It's probably not the right exact name, but there's a fund, a $500 million fund to buy up these apartment housing that is coming up for end of term, buying that up and ensuring that they continue to maintain affordable. So there's some efforts underput there. But the reality is 4 out of 5 renters in Canada today rent in private markets. And so we need solutions for private market. Getting cities to buy more property and running more housing can be a solution. And in some ways, it is a relatively easy solution because once it is managed by the government, then you can have a set of policies that you can enforce more directly than you can with more disaggregated private market rentals. And the challenge here is how do you get private market rentals to reflect these, to adopt some of these rental policies that we'd like to see. And that really has proven to be the challenge in the past. In Europe, like in Vienna, for example, a vast majority of housing is owned by council or public housing. That's not the case in Canada. And I don't think that's likely to change anything because, and the reason for that too is because not only is 1 in 3 Canadians renters right now, but renters are the number of rental housing or people who are renting is growing at the rate 2 times that of homeownership. A vast majority, a large, significant chunk of new building is going into rental housing, private rental housing. And I don't see those dynamics changing anytime soon.
Thanks, Abhi. Andrew is asking if you are evaluating any mechanisms for financing for renters or complex ownership models like condos to make programs more accessible.
Yeah, so we in our report and through our policy database, we highlight like different kind of financing mechanisms, like on-bill financing mechanism, PACE financing mechanism, things like that. We haven't, this isn't a comparative study. We're not saying, okay, take a look at Ottawa's policy compared against Toronto policies. There's not enough time in the universe to be able to go through every single policy to be able to do that. But what we do is to provide enough detail that you can go in and then try to compare these different financing mechanisms. What we do say is that there is very little evidence that financing pro mechanisms alone will get us to either the depth of deep retrofits we need to see or the scale of deep retrofits we need to see without having a component of tenant policies that ensures that the outcomes of this are the benefits of doing this accrue also, and maybe perhaps primarily to tenants. So there's different ways in which you can look at those policies and then evaluate that. But if there's appetite in doing that, Canada is a fertile playground for that because FCM and CMHC, there's a couple of different programs out there for municipal funding of energy retrofits. I know CMHC is recently launching a deep retrofit funding. And so if there are researchers out there on this call, there's a great opportunity to evaluate from an outcomes perspective what these different kind of little financing mechanisms are doing to include renters and in the different ways in which we think of restorative justice and distributive justice, procedural justice.
Emilia has seen a lot of advocacy for tenant rights and protections from renter organizers, but efficiency improvements are less common, which is understandable when your priority is housing security or cost. So, what work is being done to connect with tenant unions or other renter advocacy groups so that they are also advocating for these specific efficiency policy solutions?
That is a fantastic question. So we count ourselves at Efficiency Canada lucky to benefit from close partnerships with organizations like ACORN, Tenant Advocacy Organization, the Canada Environmental Law Association, Low Income Energy Efficiency Network. And so we've got a bunch of partnerships through which we are mobilizing this knowledge to tenant advocacy organizations that could benefit Native. But what we say in our report is that part of the challenge is that the universe of people who know, care about, and have the ability to affect energy efficiency policies, and the universe of people that know, care about, and have the ability to affect tenant policies and protections, unfortunately, those universes they don't overlap as much. And one of the things that we call for in our report is for funding, when we have deep retrofits and renovation funding, that funding not only think in terms of what the buildings need, but some of that funding to also go to tenant rights organizations, legal aid organizations. So legal aid is a joint responsibility between provincial and federal government in Canada. And the federal government is interested and is serious about getting to 2050 goals. And I see a universe in which they provide additional training, support, resources to legal aid organizations and tenant advocacy groups and organizations so that so that this universe of expertise and cooperation overlaps a little bit more closely.
This may be a tough one. Can you share any new insights on government or utility funded weatherization programs to bridge the split incentive issues with rental landlords?
You will be happy to know that if you go to the report and if you go to the spreadsheet, there is an entire spreadsheet on affordability covenants that are used in every single. So in the United States, for the last 46, 47 years now, they've had a national low income energy efficiency program. Canada doesn't have one, but the United States has had one for 47 years. So that's sinking for a moment. One of the things that the federal government there does is that it works with different provincial authorities and organizations to provide the funding that local provinces can cost match or use to direct to do energy efficiency upgrades. So each province, or I should say each state in the United States, has a different kind of model for enforcing these affordability covenants. Some say that you're not allowed to evict tenants for a certain number of years. Some say that you're not allowed to increase rents as a result of this upgrades for a certain number of years. Some say that before you evict a tenant, you're actually automatically enrolled into an eviction diversion program, because it turns out that a lot of evictions can be prevented if landlords and tenants are provided a space through which they can negotiate their differences. And so there's all these different mechanisms, and we've documented that. And so like when you open the spreadsheet, you will probably feel like a kid in a candy store, because there's at least 50, perhaps more different kind of affordability covenants, links to their language documents that you can use in your own work.
Awesome. Jonathan is asking, what's the connection to smart homes slash landlords and smart slash covenant municipal asset management? So taxes and pay for service fees. How do you manage multiple colliding jurisdictional regulations and siloed data?
That is a great question. Our report does not cover that. We don't really talk about the specifics of data wrangling, especially with smart meters, things like that. What I will say is that what we do talk about or we describe a scenario in which we have multi-fuel demand side management strategies, so that we are opening up energy efficiency policies to go beyond the silos of every single utility, right? So right now in Canada, even when you do qualify for a program, in most provinces, if you have a natural gas furnace, you qualify for an upgrade. If you're a homeowner, you qualify for an upgrade. You get a more efficient natural gas furnace, but you don't get a heat pump, for example, because some of these programs are siloed, because they're delivered by different utilities who have different kind of vertical mechanisms, who have different kind of governance structures and utilities. So on. So if you open up some of these kind of demand side management strategies to make it, to have a more larger societal responsibility, for example, to deliver cooling, a responsibility that homes, at least in one room, and I know BC has some new building codes that might reflect something, because at least one room in your home has the ability to maintain cooling, something like that. I think we can see then opening up these silos to greater collaborating and greater kind of knowledge sharing, greater resource sharing, greater data sharing between these different entities that are currently. Some great examples of this kind of work being done together, I would actually point to Ontario's low-income programs that IESO and Enbridge co-manage as great examples of what partnerships look like in delivering some of these programs.
Erica is asking, any tips for selling the idea of having a tenant liaison to a building owner prior to installing energy retrofits?
Excellent question, Erica. In our report, we go through a scenario like this, and I can speak about this from my own experience being on board of nonprofit housing. Tenants who live in the building have the lived experience of what is wrong with their units in ways that is extremely hard to capture through any kind of technical study. So a good retrofit, a successful retrofit for a property is in the Venn diagram between what the property needs. So you can do that through a technical assessment, energy audit, and so on. What the problems are, what the challenges are as experienced in the unit, which comes from the lived experience of people living in there. And then honestly, what your budget is. And so this component of, in the summers, my kitchen window has condensation in it. That actually, believe it or not, contributes to the conversation about what needs to be done, or what kind of retrofits need to be done in the house. And so if you do it poorly, if you do it informed only by technical study, there are circumstances in which you end up, for example, killing a lot of ventilation and natural exchange of air and heat in the house. And you can end up with dampness and mold and stuff on the wall, and situations in which your retrofit is actually counterproductive to your own goals. So having a tenant liaison is not just a landlord versus tenant thing, which not just reflecting the priorities of tenants within the buildings, but also providing that kind of tacit knowledge of what it's like to live in a unit, what are the challenges that are in the unit that'll actually help these become more successful. And having a tenant liaison could actually get buy-in from tenants. A significant cost overruns of retrofits happen because landlords find it difficult to secure participation or cooperation with tenants because landlords and tenants, especially in large apartment buildings, have a history of a fraught relationship, lack of trust, and issues like that. Tenant liaison, if done right, can build a bridge and rebuild trust between landlords and tenants. And doing so can elicit greater cooperation and make it easier to retrofit, not just for the tenants, but also for the landlord, reduce costs and lead to more positive outcomes.
I'm going to try and combine two questions from the audience. Helen mentioned that in Ontario, there are changes happening to the Residential Tenancies Act, which enables tenants to install window AC without fear of eviction, but it also allows landlords to increase rent to recoup utility costs. So that doesn't help low-income vulnerable populations at increased risk of heat-related illness and death. David, it brought up sub-metering of all the utilities like energy and water to make it fair for all, including the landlord. Are those two comments perhaps, can they be linked in some way? Would summary be a solution here?
Yeah, so this is a new development, Bill 97, and I largely view it as a welcome development because prior to this, it was a bit of a gray area whether tenants had the ability to install air conditioning or not in Ontario. I believe 4 years ago in Toronto Housing Corporation, an window air conditioning unit fell out and it ended up in an unfortunate death of a young child. And since then, there's been a bit of a gray area and the norms and procedures around who is liable and responsible for proper installation of AC units and stuff has been a bit of a gray area for landlords and tenants. So what Bill 97 tries to do is to perhaps provide a bit more clarity on that and saying that tenants have the right to install air conditioning without getting permission from landlords, but also saying that then if the landlord is paying for utility costs, the landlord can increase the rent to reflect some of the increased usage that comes from AC. And it's not immediately clear to me, maybe it's in the document, but it wasn't clear to me how these will be negotiated. And so smart meters can be a part of the solution in large multi-residential units. Smart metering allows landlords to charge quote unquote fairly, or at least reflect the cost of the rent based on the usage of the unit, but there's also distributional outcomes from that, right? For example, seniors need a greater amount of cooling. And if you're a low income senior, now you have to pay a greater amount of bill. And some might see it as fair, but there's also in some ways that there's the distributional fairness versus outcome-based fairness and stuff like that. So there's challenges there. Just having smart meters alone, it would be a elegant data solution, but it still will not be whether that's fair or just or not, I think is still up for debate. But it can definitely be a part of the solution. It can definitely be a part of the policy mix. So what I see an opportunity here is for municipalities or low income advocacy groups, tenant advocacy groups to come up and create these templates through which landlords and tenants can then agree upon what would be a fair additional charge for having an air conditioner. It doesn't always have to be a smart meter. And we have a scenario in the book where we say the landlord takes on the responsibility for having air conditioning in the unit because then they can ensure that it's fitted to the standard or so on and so forth in exchange for the tenant paying a nominal annual fee for maintenance of the unit and stuff like that. So there's ways in which we can structure this. What I can tell you is that when I was on the board of affordable housing, it took me as a significant amount of time and resources to figure this problem out. This was back in 2016 when I first moved to Canada, because we faced challenges in every corner. Our insurance wouldn't give us a way through which we could account for the extra liability. Some argued that we had a fiduciary responsibility for keeping the costs down. Our responsibility was to keep operating costs low. And that's what we governed on. And so having air conditioning would actually increase our operating costs. And that would be against our own bylaws. And so there's all of these things that we spent significant amount of time getting nowhere, and just being able to clarify what the responsibilities of a board, what the responsibilities of a landlord would be, what the responsibilities of a legal liability would be if a unit where something were to happen to someone as a result of the unit. Just clarifying that and just making that easier for people to figure out would be a giant step forward.
Thank you so much, Abhi, for joining us today. for the great conversation, and thanks for the great questions from the audience.
And
There were a lot of questions about receiving the report and the database links, etc. If you sign up to our mailing list, you will receive all sorts of energy efficiency developments, but especially this upcoming report in the next couple weeks.